movies. I'd like them better if I didn't have to review bad TV shows on them. TV trash. Well, we're on the verge of a new year and I've got a new location, so this seems like a good time to debut a new segment. This is TV Timeline. Where we'll take a look at something that's had multiple incarnations on TV over the years and see how they compare to one another. And what better way to start than by taking on the subject that may have been the biggest online rift of 2013, the Man of Steel, Superman. Yeah, the latest film installment of the most well-known superhero in history was polarizing to say the least. While there are people who applaud Zack Snyder and David Goyer's work for painting Superman in a more modern light, it's easy to see why Man of Steel outraged so many. They simply changed too much about his background and attitude in order to make him more relatable and edgy, and to many fans, it simply wasn't Superman anymore. However, for what it's worth, Superman has not always been exactly the same. Ever since Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel debuted the character in the premiere issue of Action Comics, Superman and the characters around him have had changes to their personas and backstories. And of course, these changes have been reflected in the many different media that Superman has appeared in, but naturally, our prime targets for this review will be the television series to primarily focus on Superman. So let's get started with the Man of Steel's first venture into episodic television, the 1950s live-action series, The Adventures of Superman.
Faster than a speeding bullet. More powerful than a locomotive. Able to leap tall buildings at a single bound.
Superman had been featured in movies and radio programs prior to taking the plunge into the still growing medium of television, and in fact, the title of this first TV show was taken from the radio show that preceded it. It was also essentially spun off from a 1951 movie titled Superman and the Mole Men. After the film's release, production began on a TV series to feature the same two stars of the movie, George Reeves as Superman and Phyllis Coates as Lois Lane. The original movie was repackaged as a two-part episode that concluded the first season. It should be noted that since television was still in its infancy at the time, and many still weren't sure it would catch on, the show had its problems getting off the ground. Reeves was actually reluctant to take on the title role at first because he was afraid few would see it. The whole first season was filmed in just 13 weeks, and then it had to wait a year until it got sponsorship from Kellogg's to start airing. When it finally did air, viewers were treated to a pilot episode that retells the origin story of the Man of Steel.
Many years ago, the planet Krypton burned like a green star in the endless heavens. Here, civilization was far advanced. It had brought forth a race of supermen, men and women like ourselves, but advanced to the absolute peak of human perfection.
The planet Orc wants to lay claim to this, but this one slacker on their planet puts them out of the picture. Yeah, can you tell this thing aired when the age of radio was still in force?
I have completed my solar calculations. And much as I dread uttering these fateful words, I have come to the conclusion that Krypton is about to be destroyed.
The man is mad. Talks like one demented. This is an insult to our intelligence.
Wow, it's like talking to climate change deniers. Did the writers of this show have a crystal ball that allowed them to see 60 years into the future? I think we know the rest of this story. Jor-El is only able to build one rocket before the destruction begins, and thus the only one they can send to safety is their infant son, Kal-El. And thus he is sent to planet Earth, where he is found by the Kent family in a scene that probably still has better production quality than half the stuff Joel and the bots have reviewed.
They named him Clark and raised him as their son.
Why can I do things that nobody else can do? Why can I run faster, jump higher? Why am I stronger than anybody?
Here we see one of the biggest differences in Superman from his earlier incarnations. Many people are aware of this, but the time in his life when Clark began to notice his abilities has varied over the years. For the longest time, he did have superhuman strength as a young kid, which led to some pretty nutty stories that I'll get into in the later shows. Clark's dad dies, one of other numerous things that would be retconned out in future incarnations, and Clark decides to move to Metropolis to try and use his abilities to help others, using a special suit that his mother made for him out of the blankets that wrapped him in his shuttle. See, this shows how Clark's desire to be a beacon of hope came from the values his parents instilled in him, and the suit is a representation of that. Are you listening, Snyder and Goyer? Clark arrives in Metropolis looking to get a job at the Daily Planet, since being involved with a newspaper would give him the resources to see when people would be in need. Fortunately, it's the 1950s, so he doesn't have to do a ton to get a job at a major metropolitan newspaper. Just save someone from a potential falling death and write up the story about it.
Pretty smart, Kent. We've got a clean beat over every other paper in town.
Does that mean I get the job, sir?
There's your answer, son.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Boy. Thanks a million.
The first couple of seasons were actually quite serious in tone compared to what we've seen from other Superman shows since. There was almost no musical background in the show outside of the opening theme, likely due to the low budget, and a lot of the stories had more of a mystery crime drama theme. Quite a few villains actually met a final fate in these first season episodes. By the third season, major changes came to the show. There had already been one big change the previous year, as Phyllis Coates left and was replaced by Noel Neill, who had played Lois in earlier movies. But now the whole tone of the show began changing. The episodes started being filmed in color, though they still aired in black and white for the original run, and the extra cost is why the seasons were reduced from 26 episodes to 13 original ones. The show began to take on a more whimsical approach, with much of the adventures involving Superman taking on really over-the-top gangsters and usually beating them with a meeting of the minds. And of course, this is where I should issue a retraction for something I criticized long ago. Back in my Batman review, I said how disappointing it was that none of Superman's comic villains were ever featured in this series. And yes, that wasn't really fair of me. The likes of Brainiac and Darkseid had not even been introduced yet, and Lex Luthor had barely been used to that point. The truth is, the Superman books hadn't really established a rogues gallery at the time the show first came out. What the show did do was introduce quite a few of the running gags on Superman that have since been in the public eye. Of course, there was the gag of how neither Lois or anyone else could ever piece together that Clark was Superman. I mean, for real, Lois always looked like she had the pieces in place, but could never put them together.
How did you leave here later than we did and beat us to the airport?
Is that all?
Not quite. How come you found the man behind the hangar at just the right moment to get his exclusive story when every top experienced reporter in the business was breaking his neck
Or her neck.
or her neck to get that story?
Maybe I'm a Superman, Miss Lane.
You're such a great representation of women's lib, Lois. And this Lois Lane wasn't exactly an airhead. Keep in mind, at the time the show debuted, America still had the after effects of the Rosie the Riveter age from World War II, where women were allowed to be much more confident, take-charge personalities. And Lois had a lot of this type going for much of the show's running. Yes, Superman would often need to rescue her, especially as the series progressed, but if anything, Jimmy Olsen needed to be saved as much, if not more, especially in the first seasons. Yeah, how come people almost never get on Jimmy's case for being a dumbass? Sadly, this series literally met a tragic end. In June 1959, George Reeves was found dead in his Benedict Canyon home. The official cause of death was ruled suicide, but since he had always had such a warm, friendly relationship with his co-stars, many around him couldn't believe that he would take his own life, and thus many suspected that it had to have been an accidental death or that maybe even he was murdered. The death of Reeves remains one of Hollywood's biggest mysteries. Following his death, the show's producers considered continuing the series, turning the focus to Jimmy Olsen, and using stunt doubles and previous footage of Reeves to play Superman. But Olsen's actor, Jack Larson, rejected the idea out of respect for Reeves, and the series was officially cancelled. The original Adventures of Superman remains one of the most beloved programs to come out of the early years of television. One could argue that this show, in addition to the likes of The Honeymooners and I Love Lucy, helped solidify television as a legitimate medium. The other stars of the show remained popular figures in Superman lore. Noelle Neal played Lois Lane's mother in the 1978 Superman movie, though her scenes were cut from the theatrical release, while Jack Larson would play an aged version of Olsen for one episode of Lois and Clark, and had speaking roles in the Superman Returns movie. George Reeves may have been gone and the first Superman TV series with him, but it would not be the end of Superman on television. The Man of Steel would take on a more animated approach in the future, and we'll start looking at that next. Superman lay dormant as a TV entity for nearly a decade following the end of the 1950 series until 1966, when DC Comics, then known as National Publications, licensed the character to Filmation to make an animated TV series. Superman had been used in animated film serials back in the 40s, but the New Adventures of Superman was made for a regular television slot on CBS Saturday mornings.
Superman, rocketed to Earth as an infant when the distant planet Krypton exploded. And who, disguised as Clark Kent, bioplanet reporter for the Daily Planet, fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and freedom with superpowers far beyond those of ordinary mortals.
The production of this show relied much more heavily on the influence of the comics than even before. George Kasdan, who had been an editor for Action Comics, wrote many of the episodes, and the animation style of the characters was based off the designs of artist Kurt Swan. And these creators obviously assumed their viewers would just know about Superman's history, because we get no pilot about Supes' origin, just thrown right into the adventures. Because of the animation format, the show was able to be more like the comics. Many episodes featured the villains that had by now become ingrained in the books, naturally led by Lex Luthor. And of course, this is the old Luthor that would become a running gag for modern audiences. A brilliant but megalomaniacal mad scientist that could build weapons and other gadgets of amazing capabilities and uses them for grand larceny, acts of terror, or attempts to destroy Superman, despite the fact that he could make billions off of such technology legally. Though it may be possible he tried and his inventions were ruined by poor marketing and development. Other villains from the comics included the Toy Man and the mischievous imp Mr. Mixia-Spitlick, as well as the TV debut of Brainiac. This is a character that has also undergone a lot of changes over the years. The most well-known incarnation of Brainiac is that of a sentient supercomputer that looks to collect data on civilizations throughout the cosmos by shrinking whole cities and imprisoning them in bottles. This version is almost like that, as he actually shrinks and collects living creatures under the orders of his creator to try and use them to rebuild the creator's destroyed home world. Kind of like a completely evil HAL 9000 trying to build the next Noah's Ark. The other character we probably need to discuss once more is Lois Lane. This was the time when Lois in the comics had pretty much been devolved into the helpless damsel that's kind of been the stigma of her persona ever since. This has probably been the closest to that version that we see on TV, as if the episode doesn't focus on Superman having to save Lois, she's usually just featured at the beginning and end to act like an airhead asking why Clark wasn't around when Superman was, if she's seen at all.
How come every time Superman appears, you disappear, and vice versa?
You wouldn't believe me if I told you.
Oh, Clark.
And that, again, is kind of the final running joke of each 6-minute short. Each one usually opens with the evil threat of the day being revealed, and Clark Kent has to disappear somewhere and change into Superman to fight the villain. Then at the end, we usually see Lois, Jimmy Olsen, or someone else commenting on how easy it was for Clark to get the story on Superman, with him only responding with a joke and a wink to the camera. Every single episode. Yeah, really, Clark, whatever's going on with your eye there, you might want to get that looked at. And I think I know the first thing most of you, especially the younger ones, immediately thought when you first saw these clips. The animation is really cheap. No backgrounds in a lot of areas, extensively used stock footage, and almost no movement whatsoever. But for what it's worth, you could argue America got out of this practice before anime did. So, yeah, take that! There were some things we put more effort into before the Japanese did. But not all of the shorts made were about Superman. Some were about...
Stay tuned for the adventures of Superboy and his super dog, Crypto.
You're getting the torches and pitchforks, aren't ya? Yes, originally Superboy was not a genetic experiment clone from Superman, or whatever he is now. He actually was Clark Kent, flying around in the cape and tights as a kid. This was a pretty big practice writers did back in the Silver Age of comics, portraying the most popular superheroes as little kids being superheroes. As if parents didn't have enough of a problem having stupid kids jumping off the roof trying to fly. And for those of you who were planning to ask, yes, I have heard of the Superboy TV series, and I may very well get to it one day. The shorts were created for an exclusive Superman season the first year, then they were part of the Superman Aquaman Hour the following season, and the Batman Superman show after that. This pretty much led into the creation of the Super Friends TV show. And cue the eye rolling and comments asking when I'll review that thing. Patience, people. I gotta admit, of all the TV incarnations of Superman, this is probably the one that aged the worst. There were some creative stories that they were able to go with thanks to the format, but a lot of the regular jokes get tiring really quickly, and the poor animation quality just can't be ignored nowadays. But again, this is probably a sign of the time when comic stories could be really goofy, characters weren't made with a lot of depth, and cartoons didn't have a huge budget. Fortunately, later generations were able to see a real evolution of Superman, especially in television and animation, starting with 1988 marked the 50th anniversary of Superman, and this was commemorated with a new animated series that was made by Ruby Spears Productions and aired on CBS Saturday mornings. From the beginning, you could see the purpose of the show was to pay homage to the history of Superman in all forms of media. The title sequence for this show brought back the original Superman exposition theme from the 1950s show, but accompanying it was an updated version of the John Williams theme music from the Superman movies of the 70s and 80s, which most who watched this series likely knew the character the most from. This was shown right from the beginning, where the first episode opens with a remake of one of the movie's most classic scenes, Superman and Lois Lane flying together, which apparently is their regular date night.
Flying like this is wonderful.
I know. Metropolis is beautiful at night.
I meant flying with you is wonderful.
Yeah, I was going to make some kind of orgasm joke about this, but decided to keep it tasteful. Or maybe I just had too many jokes to choose from. The movies obviously influenced the animation also, as these designs of Superman and Lois were clearly modeled after Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder. However, it also took after the changes that had been recently made to the mythos within the comic books. The head writer of this show was Superman comic writer Marv Wolfman, and he implemented a number of the changes that fellow writer John Byrne had put in after DC's major reboot event of 1985, Crisis on Infinite Earths. One of the major issues dealt with was Lex Luthor. Instead of just being a mad scientist who built insane technology to rule the world because evil, Lex would now be a corporate business giant who already had mass money and power, and Superman became the obstacle keeping him from becoming even more powerful by any means necessary. Seriously, it's like Rupert Murdoch read these new stories and Lex became his idol.
He crushed my tank! I'd sue him for destruction of private property!
But it would probably implicate me in the robbery.
I'm not gonna give my nemesis the proof he needs to put me away! Not like that Joker in Gotham City! The Riddler! The other area was Lois. She was already gradually shedding the image of being a helpless damsel and dimwit by the late 70s, but here she was fully established as having grown up an army brat, and therefore someone who was not afraid to get into situations where she ultimately got in over her head, thus needing Superman's help. For crying out loud, lady, is a Pulitzer worth that much if you're willing to risk having it awarded posthumously? And even her dislike of Clark was given better motivation, as he became a threat to her status as the Daily Planet's #1 reporter.
What is this?
First-hand account?
I don't care what you've been through, Clark Kent. There's no way you're going to bump my Pulitzer Prize-winning story.
Or maybe she was just trying to kid herself from her real feelings. Taking a cue from David Maddie, perhaps? Also, the whole issue of Clark's secret identity began being handled much better. Thanks to Christopher Reeve's portrayal in the movies, it was established that Clark Kent purposely acts like a complete goober or some other type of persona that leads to a much more effective disguise, making people think, okay, maybe he kinda resembles Superman, but no way could this dork ever actually be him!
Superman! Over here! My tapes! Oh, Lois, calling back quick. My set of Disco Mozart is drowning down there.
Clark Kent, you to amaze me. Someone's just tried to blow us to pieces.
Yeah, that guy is Superman? Please, next you'll be telling me that womanizing billionaire in Gotham is, I don't know, the Penguin. Each episode actually had one major Superman adventure, followed by a mini-episode at the very end. The final act featured a story called Superman Family Album, which, you guessed it, was again about Clark Kent, the superpowered kid. Though, for what it's worth, the episodes actually followed a timeline in their running order, showing Clark growing up in Smallville, Kansas. It started with John and Martha Kent choosing to adopt the young child upon discovering him, after first giving him to an orphanage and he more or less ruining that. And each episode showed a later time in his youth, leading up to his graduation and eventual move to Metropolis, where we see a retelling of how he became Superman, which, aside from his dad still being alive, was still pretty close to what was told in the first series. It's actually the most thorough description I've seen any show do of Clark's youth. At least until... one step at a time, people. And in fact, it was in that last short that I saw something I don't think I saw in any other TV incarnation. Superman changing in a phone booth. Actually, who thought up that idea in the first place? I mean, given that a phone booth is a see-through enclosure, often in a highly public area, it actually doesn't make a lot of sense for Clark Kent to be changing into a superhero getup in one of those things. You know, give all these TV creators credit for more or less phasing that out of existence. What would they even do for that nowadays? Would Clark change out of costume in an internet cafe? The Ruby Spears series lasted only one season, but it remains a popular entry in the franchise among those who saw it in its original run and many other Superman fans. Thanks to Time Warner now owning almost all of Ruby Spears' library, getting the series an eventual DVD release was no problem. Of course, Time Warner itself would eventually make its own mark on Superman in animation, and we'll look into that right after this. As I've mentioned in other reviews, the 1990s saw a huge revitalization in animation, and Warner Brothers was right at the forefront. After seeing success with the likes of Tiny Toon Adventures, Animaniacs, and other shows that harken back to their Looney Tunes days, they turned their attention to the DC Comics properties, which by now they pretty much had full control over. The Batman animated series became one of their biggest hits and laid the foundation for a new DC animated universe under the command of Bruce Timm and Paul Dini, and it continued with Superman, the animated series. While the Ruby Spears series did give us snippets into Clark's youth, this one decided to start completely from the beginning. For the first time since the live-action series, we open on Krypton, where Jor-El presents his case that the planet faces imminent destruction, but here they give an additional reason why the High Council won't believe him. Brainiac has been retooled into the planet's data storage system, pretty much the Kryptonian Library of Congress. He rebukes Jor-El's claims and turns the people against him, but this is to distract everyone else while he looks to save his own digital ass by transferring himself to a satellite. So, like the other stories, Clark is sent to Earth and is found and taken in by the Kents, and I gotta admit, they really turned Martha into a hottie for this one. And then we fast forward to Clark Kent as a teen, where he confesses to Lana Lang that some things have been happening to him.
In the last few months, I've been hearing things, you know? Things I couldn't before.
You're saying you can see through walls? So, how many times have you peeked into the girls' locker room, huh?
Lana?
Now, it was at some point around the 90s, I'm guessing around the 0 Hour event in the comics, but I haven't read those books to be sure, that Clark's backstory changed again to where he didn't start developing his powers until his later teenage years, probably having something to do with puberty combined with the yellow sun radiation that has since become embedded as the source of his powers. This, of course, eliminated all of those Superboy stories and crazy tales about him doing stuff as a baby from continuity. His parents reveal how they found him, and he discovers a recording from his natural parents telling him where he came from. And I don't know how many agree on this, but I think they got Clark's reaction to this pretty believable. How long would a teenager be scared and upset to discover he's from another planet and abnormal? Until just about the time that he discovers he can freaking fly. We then forward to Metropolis, where the mysterious flying man is already getting noticed, and Clark Kent joins the Daily Planet staff to the chagrin of star reporter Lois Lane.
Look, Smallville, nothing against you, but even as a kid, I never liked babysitting. You want to keep up with me, you gotta be quick. I'm no tour guide and I don't hold hands.
So right away, let me just say this. The voice talent they got for this series leaps and bounds above the others. No, don't get me wrong, there was nothing horrible about Lois in the previous show, but to me, Jenny McSwain's portrayal could sometimes be a bit...
Exclusive rights to the biggest news story in history, and we're going to miss it, because Clark, Mr. Punctual Kent, picked today as his first time ever to be late.
Grating. Also, I felt Michael Bell's portrayal of Lex Luthor was still a little too over the top and goofy. Here, Dana Delaney gave Lois more of a snarky side and comes off as much more no-nonsense and take-no crap.
I can't figure out how some yokel from Smallville is suddenly getting every hot story in town.
Well, Lois, the truth is, I'm actually Superman in disguise, and I only pretend to be a journalist in order to hear about disasters as they happen and then squeeze you out of the byline.
You're a sick man, Kent.
And then there's Clancy Brown's portrayal of Lex. I mean, damn! Just listening to him, you completely believe that he's a cold, calculating Machiavellian mastermind, but still comes off with the charisma that would make people gravitate to him.
You're very amusing, Mr. Kent, is it? Yes, I'll remember that. You see, Superman, I own Metropolis. My technology built it, my will keeps it going, and nearly 2/3 of its people work for me whether they know it or not. Even you have to admit it's a model of efficiency.
Of course, once again, Luthor is not the only foe Superman must deal with. We also get many more from Supes' Rogues Gallery, along with some new ones. Probably my favorite baddie that was made for this show was Livewire, a shock jock voiced by Lori Petty that got electrocuted into an evil electric energy being.
Come back to the hospital. They might be able to help you.
What do I need help for? I'm pure energy now. And besides, I got enough help from you the other night.
I don't know. I know she started out as one of the few humans in Metropolis who spewed hate at Supes, likely because she was on Lex's radio station, but for some reason, this character just struck a chord with me.
Look, baby, to make it in this town, I had to be better, sharper, and louder than any man to get half as much notice. And nothing was handed to me on a silver platter either, unlike your friend Superman.
It's some attitude you have there.
Pays the bills.
Yeah, I find myself drawn to a loudmouth, sarcastic media personality. Who's really surprised? But a lot of the other classic villains were very well done also, and just perfectly voiced. Many remember just how menacing Darkseid was in this show, but also turning in great hilarious performances. Gilbert Gottfried as Mixia Spitlick, Brad Garrett as Lobo. If those roles took more than 10 seconds to cast, I'd be shocked.
You don't have to say it backward. You have to get me to say it.
Say what?
Kill Tipsy, Jim! Gosh, you're thick. Now for the this time! Ah, nuts.
Oh yeah, someone is definitely tired of breathing. I'm the night manager at the Hotel de Frag. Looky there, it's checkout time.
We were also introduced to a few other of the DC superheroes in this show, as this was when The Flash made his debut, along with John Henry Irons. I'm also sure a lot of the fans were glad to see the original Supergirl brought into this series, instead of the types that were used in the comics at this time, but I'm not so sure they were as thrilled with this Green Lantern, since they used Kyle Rayner and gave him Hal Jordan's origin as the Lantern. Yeah, this was after Hal had turned evil in the comics, and DC was really trying to shill Kyle, and I'm guessing it only pissed quite a few people off. But of course, the episode everyone probably remembers from this series is the two-parter World's Finest, where Superman and Batman meet for the first time.
It's over, Joker. Thank you. I couldn't have saved Lois without your help. I'm aware of that.
Seriously, we need to send thousands of copies of this episode to Goyer and Snyder to show them how this crossover is done! Despite being an updated version, the show still harkened back to past media. At least one episode, Monkey Fun, was a retelling of the episode The Chimp Who Made It Big from the Filmation series. Meanwhile, Sarah Douglas, who portrayed Zod's Lieutenant Ursa in Superman 2, voiced the evil Kryptonian Mala in her later appearances in the series. Maybe in a future series, Dana Delaney will be brought back to voice Martha Kent. Actually, that sounds kinda creepy. The 90s cartoon spent 2 seasons as their own series before becoming the Batman-Superman Adventures in 1998. And, like the Batman series that preceded it, this Superman animated series was a huge hit, and it gave Warner just what they needed to launch the next major entry into the DC animated universe, Justice League. For many, it was a much more mature version of Super Friends that allowed many of DC's superheroes a place to shine. Though I thought Power Girl got the shaft in this one. And so there you have it. Nearly 50 years of Superman's portrayal on television. Looking back at all these shows, I will say they're a good example of how adapting a comic book probably works best with television. Sure, there are some good comic book movies out there, but if you're adapting something that's already episodic, going to another episodic medium will often give you the best results. As for these shows themselves, I admittedly have a bias toward the 90s Warner series, but each has its good points in its own right, along with its own quirks and different interpretations of not just Superman/Clark, but the other characters, and those portrayals did fit how they were portrayed in the books at the time. Superman has truly evolved through the years, ever since Siegel and Schuster first put the character to paper, and the character that Time Warner animated in the 90s is a far cry from the one George Reeves portrayed in the 50s. Is this going to make more old school Superman fans accept Man of Steel more? Probably not, and it does make you wonder where the character is going to go in the future, especially with the latest DC reboot. Maybe the Superman we grew up with won't exist after a while and be replaced with some full-on brooding vigilante, but at least we can always go back to entries like these TV shows and find the true Man of Steel that we always looked up into the sky for. And here's hoping that this fresh start on the Rowdy Reviewer series will send this show up, up, and away to heights never before seen. See you next time on TV Trash.